Adolf Hitler. Here's a story almost everyone thinks they know. Adolf Hitler, the infamous dictator of Nazi Germany, met his end not on a battlefield, but in a rather less glamorous place, his underground bunker in Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the German capital, Hitler chose to commit suicide rather than face capture or trial. By that moment, the Third Reich was disintegrating, and Hitler's grand visions had reduced to a desperate bid to stay in command. Instead of stepping out like a villain in an old movie, he and his wife Eva Braun, who had just married days before, decided to end their lives together, a dramatic exit fitting the twisted story of their reign. The method? A self-inflicted gunshot to the head, combined with cyanide poisoning for Eva. Their bodies were quickly burned by loyal aides in the bunker's garden to prevent them from becoming trophies for the Soviets. Hitler's death stands as a symbol of the collapse of one of history's deadliest regimes. Yet the aftermath gave rise to wild conspiracy theories about his fate. Despite the rumors, no credible evidence supports any escape, and history clearly records his final day. When all the power and terror crumble, even the most notorious dictators choose disappearance over accountability. Benito Mussolini. The Italian dictator's final moments are far from a graceful exit. Benito Mussolini, the man who fancied himself the ultimate strongman of Italy, met a messy and rather unceremonious end in April 1945. As World War II was winding down, Mussolini tried to escape the inevitable by fleeing north with his mistress and a small group of followers, hoping to reach neutral Switzerland. Spoiler, that didn't work. Captured by Italian partisans, essentially the resistance fighters who had had just about enough of fascist drama, Mussolini was swiftly executed by firing squad. Talk about getting kicked out of the party early. His body, along with that of his mistress, was then dumped in a gas station in the village of Giulino di Mezzagra. But the story doesn't stop there. In a final act of symbolic humiliation, Mussolini's corpse was hung upside down in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, essentially a public display to send a loud and clear message. This is what happens to dictators. Passers-by were invited to jeer, throw things, and generally treat the remains as a grim curiosity, a fate pretty far from the grandiose legacy Mussolini once envisioned. Joseph Stalin. What's the grand finale for the Soviet Union's iron-fisted dictator? Joseph Stalin didn't go out with a bang or a bolt of lightning. No dramatic execution or battlefield demise. Instead, the man who ruled with an iron fist died quietly of natural causes in March 1953. After years of paranoia, purges, and rewriting history, Stalin suffered a massive stroke in his Kuntsevo dacha outside Moscow and simply didn't recover. His death came quietly, far from the scale of destruction he caused. No secret plot, no assassination, just a brain hemorrhage that left him paralyzed and silent. He was found on the floor by his guards, who apparently waited hours before calling a doctor. Talk about loyalty mixed with hesitation. Stalin's death sparked a power struggle that eventually led to the Soviet Union's thaw, but at the moment, it left the country both stunned and cautious. After years of fear, his sudden vulnerability was almost shocking. Franco, Spain's longtime dictator, took a slow, quiet exit. After nearly 40 years of iron-fisted rule, Franco died in 1975 from natural causes, Parkinson's disease and heart failure. No drama, no showdown, just a gradual fade. By the time Franco's health took a nosedive, the world had already moved on, and Spain was quietly gearing up for a new chapter. His death marked the end of an era filled with repression, censorship, and an endless supply of fascist bravado. Yet, instead of going out with a bang, he shuffled off this mortal coil in a hospital bed in Madrid, surrounded by doctors rather than bullets or revolutionaries. Why did Franco's end seem so anticlimactic? Unlike other dictators who faced violent deaths or betrayals, Franco managed to cling to power until his body finally gave out. No dramatic coups, no last-minute betrayals, just a slow goodbye to a man who refused to relinquish control until he physically couldn't. Mao Zedong. How did the founder of modern China say goodbye to the world stage? Mao Zedong, the man who reshaped an entire nation and sparked both revolution and famine, didn't get a dramatic exit. Instead, after years of declining health, Mao died quietly on September 9, 1976, from complications related to a series of heart attacks and respiratory issues. After decades of ruling with an iron grip, complete with cultural revolutions, purges, and policies that cost millions of lives, Mao's final days were surprisingly low-key. He passed away in Beijing, surrounded by doctors and aides who had watched his health slowly unravel. Not exactly the fiery farewell one might expect from a man who had cultivated a cult of personality that made him seem larger than life. What makes Mao's death particularly ironic? Despite all his attempts to control everything, from ideology to people's daily lives, he couldn't dodge the basic vulnerabilities of the human body. His death triggered a power struggle within the Communist Party and eventually led to major reforms that shifted China away from his extreme policies. Mao didn't die in violence or sudden collapse. He simply wore down over time. The man who demanded absolute loyalty left quietly, proving even the toughest dictators face the same end as everyone else. Pol Pot. The final moments of one of history's most ruthless dictators were surprisingly uneventful. Pol Pot, the mastermind behind Cambodia's Khmer Rouge and the architect of a genocide that wiped out nearly a quarter of his country's population, didn't get a dramatic trial or a swift execution. Instead, he died quietly on April 15, 1998, reportedly from a heart attack, or maybe poison, depending on which version of the story you prefer. After years of ruling Cambodia with a reign of terror, forcing mass evacuations, and orchestrating brutal purges, Pol Pot was eventually ousted by Vietnamese forces in 1979. But instead of facing justice, he spent his last years under house arrest by a faction of his own former comrades. Talk about an awkward retirement. Pol Pot's death came without the fanfare or closure many expected. No courtroom drama, no final confession, just a quiet exit shrouded in mystery. The man responsible for one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century slipped away from the world largely unnoticed, avoiding the punishment he so clearly deserved. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the iron-fisted ruler of Romania's curtain call, was swift, brutal, and unmistakable. Nicolae Ceaușescu's end was less about a slow fade and more of a lightning-fast knockout. By December 1989, after decades of oppressive rule, mass poverty, and a personality cult worthy of a Netflix drama, the Romanian people had finally had enough. As protests erupted across the country, Ceaușescu and his wife, Elena, tried to flee Bucharest by helicopter, because nothing says "I'm out of here" like a last-minute aerial escape. But spoiler alert, they didn't get far. Captured by the military, the couple was put on an impromptu trial that lasted a grand total of about an hour. In that brief trial, they were found guilty of charges like genocide and abuse of power. No lengthy courtroom battles or dramatic appeals, just a swift sentence, execution by firing squad. Moments later, the Ceaușescus were gone, marking one of the quickest and most brutal ends for a dictator. What's remarkable is how quickly Romania closed the book on its dictatorship, with the execution broadcast on national television. Kim Il-sung. How does the founder of North Korea, the man who practically invented cult of personality, say goodbye? Kim Il-sung, known as the Great Leader, didn't die in a grand battle or get overthrown in a coup. Nope, he passed away peacefully on July 8, 1994, from a heart attack. Not exactly the fiery end you might expect from a man who declared himself eternal president for life. After decades of ruling with absolute control, launching wars, and building a regime that made North Korea one of the most secretive and isolated countries in the world, Kim's death was surprisingly normal. He died in Pyongyang, surrounded by loyalists who quickly declared him the eternal president, ensuring that, officially at least, he never really left. The country went into mourning with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints, or maybe rock stars. His son, Kim Jong-il, seamlessly took over the reins, continuing the family business of authoritarian rule.